Hello everyone. Today we are starting with a new chapter of environment and ecology, and this chapter is biodiversity. Now when we talk about this chapter, first speaking from the point of view of its importance in the examination, you'll find that in prelims and in mains examination it has equal weightage. You have high likeliness of questions coming in the prelims also, and you have a very high likeliness of questions coming in the mains also. And very often you will see that the questions that are coming here are either conceptual in nature or they are based on some species or the other which have been in news. So these are two aspects that you will have to cover. Now one thing is that this is a big chapter, and this is a chapter which also has a lot of importance, not only from the point of view of your syllabus but also from the point of view of the earth and the survival of the earth. So you need to understand each and every part of this chapter, each and every aspect of this chapter very thoroughly. So what we will do is we'll go into the conceptual details of each and every part one by one, and also some of the questions that can come in the examination both from prelims as well as from mains perspective. So first of all, when we talk about this particular term biodiversity, if you try to break it down, you will get the meaning of it. The meaning basically will come from these two words, one being bio and the second being diversity. So if you break it down, basically it becomes biological diversity. So we are talking about the biological diversity of the earth. Now, when we talk about biological diversity, we know that there are a lot of ways in which we can define it. So for example, you can talk about diversity in terms of the genetic variability of an organism. You can talk about the different kinds of ecosystems that are present. We have already spoken about the meaning of ecosystem and some of the examples we have seen. So you know that ecosystems can be aquatic, ecosystems can be terrestrial. On land you have completely different set of organisms. Underwater you have completely different set of organisms. Not only underwater, even underwater you can define on the basis of whether it is marine or freshwater ecosystem. So in the marine ecosystem, you have completely different set of organisms. In the freshwater aquatic ecosystem, you have completely different set of organisms. So we know that the variability of organisms is a lot. It can be on the basis of the genetic makeup. It can be on the basis of the different kinds of species. It can be on the basis of different kinds of ecosystems. So there are a lot of ways in which we can define this biological diversity. So then comes into the question, how do we define it? What should be the proper way to define biological diversity or biodiversity? We'll come to that, but first let me introduce you to the topics that we are going to deal with in this chapter so that you are aware of what exactly and how we are going about it. So first of all, we'll start with a basic introduction to all the chapters or all the topics that we have here. Then we'll look at elements of biodiversity. That is, what is the meaning of species variability? What is the meaning of genetic variability? What is the meaning of ecosystem variability? So all these kind of things we'll have a look at. Then the measurement, how do we measure the biodiversity? The importance of biodiversity, the meaning of hotspots. Often a lot of questions have been asked from here. You'll see that in the previous year papers, hotspot has been one of the hotspots of the question papers. Then you have extinction, a very, very important topic. Loss of biodiversity, how does the loss happen? What is the impact of the loss of biodiversity? Then the conservation of biodiversity, how do we conserve? What are the various ways of conserving the biodiversity? And ultimately, towards the end, we'll have a look at the biogeographical regions of India. How do we divide the various regions in India according to how their ecosystems look? So this is a basic outline of what we are going to do, and each and every topic here on we are going to start with in detail. So first up with a basic introduction. So as I said, how do we define biodiversity? So if we go by the official definition that was given in the Earth Summit 1992, it was the variability among living organisms from all sources including inter-alia, that is among others, terrestrial, marine and other aquatic ecosystems and the ecological complexes which they are part of. This includes diversity within species, between species and of ecosystems. So let us break it down first. Let us try to understand what is the meaning of this definition. But before we do that, there comes another question. That is, was this the first time that we started to look at this particular term biodiversity? Or did we know about this term before? So if you go into the history, you will see that there have been a couple of instances where this particular term was introduced into the scientific world. There was a very long time back at around 1915 that there was one paper that was published in the Scientific American that this term was used. But again, this was not a term which was used popularly. It was just one of the scientific terms that came in one of the papers. Then after that, you will see that in 1980s, all of a sudden, this term started to become very popular. For example, in 1980, we see that there was one scientist, Thomas Lovejoy. He was the one who introduced this term. There was a book that he had written, and in this book, he had introduced the term for the first time. And this was 1980. But after that, this term became very significantly important after two of the scientists who were popular in the field of ecology started to use this term. First up, there was Walter Rosen, Edward Wilson, another scientist. And this name, Edward Wilson, is very, very important for you from the point of view of biodiversity. Many people consider him to be the father of biodiversity. Walter Rosen is the person who introduced the term, or rather defined the term biodiversity. And in terms of Walter Rosen, if you talk about the definition that was given by him, he defined the term to be something like this: the richness in variety and variability of species of all living organisms in a given region. And by region, basically he meant habitat. So this was the definition that was given by Walter Rosen. Now, this was, you can say, for the first time that biodiversity was defined. So when we are looking at this term biodiversity, which is such an often used term today, until 1985, it was actually a topic that was not even discussed. It was a term that was not even defined. So that's why we see that all of a sudden this started to become a popular word, a word that was used by the scientists, especially the ecologists. And then Edward Wilson, the one who made it very popular, the one who is also considered to be the father of biodiversity, he defined this term in a very simple manner. And for him at this point of time, it was all living things living on the planet, all living things that exist on the planet. So this is how he had coined the term biodiversity. But then in 1992, this official definition that we spoke of, this came into account. This was given by the Convention on Biodiversity 1992 during the Earth Summit. So what it says is variability among living organisms from all sources, including terrestrial, marine, other aquatic ecosystems, and the ecological complexes of which they are part. This includes diversity within species. Just remember this: diversity within species, between species, and of the ecosystem. So that's why these three become the levels at which we need to understand biodiversity. These three become the elements of biodiversity. And we'll have a discussion on this as well. But when we talk about this definition, this although is the first time that you can say in a legal manner there was a definition that was given for biodiversity. But at the same time, even many of the scientists point out that this was not perhaps a complete definition. Because when we talk about this definition, and if you look at the words used closely, it has never been mentioned that something that was living in the past is also a part of the biodiversity. That is, we are not considering any of the fossils to be a part of biodiversity. Anything that existed beforehand is not a part of biodiversity. So this is one part that many scientists say that perhaps it missed out on. Not only this, there are some other criticisms as well. Because when it comes to the convention and the objectives that were defined in the convention, they have some things written there that do not make the scientists and the ecologists very happy. For example, Article 1 of the convention basically talks about fair and equitable sharing of the resources that are coming out of the biodiversity of the earth. Now, when we talk about fair and equitable sharing, this is where there is a problem. That even if we are defining biodiversity, we are actually defining biodiversity on the basis of how we are going to use it. That is, we are considering them as a resource. So this is one problem, that everything is value laden. And because it is value laden, that becomes a very big problem. Because everything is now being looked at from a commercial level, maybe from the point of view of how they can have an advantage for the humankind. Because when we talk about biodiversity, perhaps we forget that we are also a part of the ecosystem. We are also a part of this biodiversity. We actually consider ourselves to be different from all the other species, whether plants or animals. Humans are being considered separately, which is not correct. So everything being value laden is one problem. The other problem, or the other side of the problem, is philosophical in nature, you can say, where we say that when we talk about this biodiversity, this is something that we can say is a knowledge that we have gained over millions of years. Because if you go back in history, you know that early Earth did not have ozone layer. And since it did not have ozone layer, the life as it exists today could not exist, because obviously a lot of ultraviolet rays used to come to the surface of the earth, and the survival of species was not possible. But then as the ozone layer started to develop, there was an atmosphere that started to develop. Because of this atmosphere, there were conditions that were formed on the earth, because of which we have such a rich diversity of species today. It did not exist. So basically it is something, you can say, a kind of knowledge that has been gained over millions of years. The evolution has happened over millions of years, and all this is basically a kind of library that the humankind is burning today. Today we are actually destroying a lot of species. You know what is happening to our forests. You know that extinctions are happening at a very rapid manner, and these are again all the things that we'll have a discussion upon, but we know that these things are happening. So all these are parts of the problem, also because they haven't been properly, or in the legal documents have not been dealt with. So these are some of the aspects that come into the controversy, some of the aspects that are often seen as criticisms of the definition or the conventions that we have. Now, coming back to the definition, still let's summarize what the definition says. The definition is basically talking about the variability among living organisms from all sources. All sources meaning it can be terrestrial, it can be aquatic. Variability among living organisms. The living organisms can be plants, the living organisms can be animals, it can be microscopic organisms, it can be anything that is existing today on the earth. So we take everything into account while talking about the variability. Then after that, we also talk about the ecological complexes of which they are a part of. Then we are also talking about the diversity within the species, between the species, and of the ecosystems. So there are all these aspects that are included in the definition. So basically we are talking about each and every organism that exists, each and every organism with its variability in its genetic makeup, in its species makeup, everything being included becomes the part of the definition. This is how we define biodiversity, and some of the criticisms that have come on its way. As I said, that when we talk about biodiversity, we do not even think of humans being a part of the definition. We think of all the organisms, every plant and animal. We do not think of the humans. We start to think of the humans when something like COVID comes into the picture. And you know that a small microscopic virus, which is not even visible, can be such a disaster for one species. And this species has been human beings this time. So let's not go into that detail, but yes, these are some of the criticisms of the definition and how we look at biodiversity. Now, having understood the meaning of biodiversity and establishing the definition of biodiversity, the next topic that we need to start with is the elements of biodiversity. Now, when you talk about this particular term, elements of biodiversity, if you refer to different sources, you will see that it is being used in various forms. For example, sometimes you will see the same topics being discussed as components of biodiversity, sometimes as levels of biodiversity, sometimes as types of biodiversity. But I would say that talking about this particular topic, elements is a right word to use, or if not, components will be a right term. So either you should see it as elements of biodiversity or components of biodiversity. Labeling it as levels of biodiversity or labeling it as types of biodiversity is not entirely correct, and we'll come to why. So first of all, when we talk about elements of biodiversity, these are the kinds of biodiversity that will help us define the ways in which biodiversity can be understood or studied. For example, when we talk about biodiversity, we discuss that this is the variety or the variability. Now this variety or variability can come in various forms. For example, you can talk about the variety within a species. You can talk about variety within a population. You can talk about variety in a given ecosystem. Or you can talk about the variety in a given biome as well. So there are multiple ways in which this can be defined, so that you can understand how to define biodiversity in various ways, in various forms. So the first thing that we need to understand here is genetic diversity. Now the first element of biodiversity that we need to discuss is genetic diversity. Now when we talk about genetic diversity, what exactly does it mean? Genetic diversity usually will be used for a single species, the kinds of diversity that happens within a given species. Although it can also be used for different species and the genetic variability that happens in various species, but usually it will be used only for a given species. Now when we talk about a given species and the variation in a given species, what do we mean? Think about humans only. You know that humans have different variations. You have come across different races. You know that many of these races are completely different from one another, look completely different from one another, and there are genetic variations because of which this is happening. Species wise, all of these are Homo sapiens, but although they are Homo sapiens, still there is a variability that you observe. You go to Europe, you go to Africa, you go to Americas, even in India, you see that various regions of India have various races, and all these races kind of look different from one another. So this is something that you have observed. I came across this very particular picture that I took while I was visiting the market in Bangalore. So I found out this picture and I thought that this is what will make my lecture. So what you see here are various kinds of bananas, right? These are all bananas. They are not different from one another. They are all some variations in the genetic forms of banana that makes them look different. Species wise, every one of these are a form of banana. But you might buy the red one, you might buy the bigger one, you might buy the smaller one, depends on your choice, right? But what we see is single species but in various forms. Why is it happening? Because of the genetic variations that is happening in the banana. So fortunately I just came across this and I thought that this is a picture that I should click, so that I am able to explain you better what is the meaning of this genetic variability. So this is the first kind of, or the first element of biodiversity. Apart from that, the second element of biodiversity is species biodiversity. Now when we talk about species diversity, what is the meaning? The meaning is the number of species of plants and animals that are present in a given region. So the variation that you see when you are looking at a given population or when you are looking at a given ecosystem. So given in that ecosystem, you will find that there are various kinds of plants and animals. For example, if I take this picture, so what do you see are various kinds of insects, various kinds of plants, etc. that might be found in a given single ecosystem. You go to a single forest and you might find all these kinds of various species. So this is a variation that is happening not within the species, but rather among the species in a given area, in a given forest, in a given country, a geographical area. It can be anything, but the kinds of variations that we find in a given area among all the species that are present there. So here I am not talking about one single species and the genetic variations in them. I am talking about a given area or an ecosystem, or rather a country, geographical location. It can be anything, but the kinds of variation that I'll see there. So that becomes the species diversity. Now if you look at this picture, what do you see is basically the difference between species diversity and genetic diversity. So when we talk about genetic diversity, what we discussed is single species, variations in them. So if you look at the second picture, what do you see? You see that all the three are the same trees, but there are certain variations in the leaves or the color of their leaves, but they being the same tree. But if you look at the first picture on the top, what do you see here are basically three different varieties of trees. So all these are not the same trees. They are completely different from one another. There are possibilities that they might even not be found in a given ecosystem. They might be found in different ecosystems. And they are completely different in their genetic makeup. So that's why you see that they are completely different looking from one another, and that's why they are not the same. They are three different species of trees. The third element that we need to talk about is the ecological diversity. We are talking about a phenomena that can be described for a specific geographical location, a political entity like a country, state, or even a taluka. So when we talk about ecological diversity, there can be many ways in which we define it. First of all, it can be on the basis of the types of ecosystems that you have. For example, an aquatic ecosystem will look completely different from a terrestrial ecosystem. Even within an aquatic ecosystem, you might have a freshwater ecosystem and a marine ecosystem. And these two again will be completely different from one another. So these are ecological changes that we are looking at. And when we look at biodiversity from this angle, we call it as ecological diversity. So this ecological diversity can be on the basis of the kinds of ecosystems. It can be on the basis of a geographical region. It can be on the basis of a political region, like a country. So in that case also, we can define in various ways what can be the meaning of ecological diversity. So if you look at this particular picture, you will understand the meaning. Here we are not talking about a single species or a population of species or the different kinds of species that are present in a given location or a given ecosystem. But rather we have gone one step up, and here we are talking about different kinds of ecosystems or geographical locations where we might find all these different kinds of species or the genetic variations that we talked about. So that's why this becomes one step up. Coming back to the topic that we started with, that calling it a type of biodiversity or calling it a level of biodiversity is still not okay. Because many a times what happens is there will be a gray area. When we are within a species, when we are looking at the genetic makeup, at that point of time, it's very easy for you to divide between what is the meaning of genetic and what is the meaning of species diversity. But as you start to come up, what you will see is that within a population, we can also talk about species diversity and we can also talk about genetic diversity. So, for example, we can talk about the genetic diversity between a tiger and a leopard. Both of them are panthers. Talking about biological terms, both of them are panthers. But tigers are very different in genetic makeup as compared with leopards, right? So, although they can also be clubbed as species diversity, because leopards are completely different species as compared to tigers, but at the same time, you can also talk about the genetic variability that has come in within a genera of panthers. So that's why here it is a gray area whether to talk about genetic diversity or to talk about species diversity. And that's why when we do this, it's probably not correct of us to talk about levels of biodiversity or types of biodiversity. So that's why what I said is that when we talk about these three variations, genetic, species and ecological diversity, we should either call them as components or we should call them as elements of diversity. That will be a more appropriate term. Now then comes another term, which is functional diversity. So what is the meaning of functional diversity? The way species behave, obtain food and use the natural resources of an ecosystem is known as functional diversity. Now, as we discuss elements of biodiversity, there is another term that becomes very important for you, and that is functional diversity. Often this term is not used pretty much. You'll only find the mention somewhere or the other, but still you should know the meaning of it. And while trying to understand the meaning of functional diversity, we are going back to chapter number 1, where we were discussing about the interactions that happens either between the species or between a species and its non-living environment. So when you talk about that, you know that a species in a given ecosystem has a particular role. It has a role whether depending on the hierarchy, where it lies in that hierarchy, or on the basis of what role it needs to have in a given ecosystem. Depending on the kind of ecosystem a given species is, probably it will have different kinds of roles. So that's why this is where functional diversity comes into picture. So what exactly it is? It is the way species behave, obtain food and use the natural resource of an ecosystem. So this is what functional diversity is. Basically, we are again talking about the interactions that we had discussed in detail in the first chapter of ecology. So this is the topic of elements of biodiversity. So to summarize what we have learned here, if you look at this particular picture, you'll understand when we talk about genetic diversity, we are talking about the variations in the genetic makeup that happens within a species. So all these various kinds of seashells are telling you about the genetic diversity that happens in these shells. Then we are talking about the species diversity. So species diversity would mean various kinds of species that you have in a given geographical location or an ecosystem, etc. Then after that you have the ecological diversity, that basically depends on the various kinds of ecosystems or the geographical area, country, etc. And then finally, on the basis of the interactions that you have, for example, we had talked about the food chain or the food web, etc. That basically comprises the functional diversity. So the biological and chemical processes such as energy flow and matter recycling needed for the survival of species, communities, and ecosystems. So basically we are talking about flow of energy and flow of matter that we have already seen in our previous chapters. So this is the topic of elements of biodiversity. Now moving on, one important topic that comes with the elements of biodiversity is something called as the bottleneck effect. Now when we talk about bottleneck effect, what is the meaning? As you can see in the picture, probably you will understand here. If you look at, let's say, sides A and side B, what is the difference that you see? If you look at side A, what you see are different kinds of beads. You have a yellow colored bead, you have a violet colored bead, a pink colored bead, an orange colored bead, a green colored bead, etc. Right? But when you look at side B, what do you see? You either have orange colored bead or you have a green colored bead. So what basically it denotes are various genetic types. We are talking about genetic types which would have existed before something like this happened and then after something like this happened. So what is this bottleneck effect? When we talk about bottleneck effect, what happens in a species is many a times, due to maybe natural causes, due to maybe human induced causes, there will be decrease in the population of a given species. And if there is a decrease in the population, it's very evident that genetic variability will also start to decrease. For example, initially for a given species, you might have had all these different kinds of genetic variations. But after a certain problem, let's say it can be an earthquake, it can be a volcanic eruption, it could be human activities, for example, the destruction of habitat for a given species. So in all these cases, what will happen is ultimately you will see that with the decrease in population, many of the genetic varieties will die out and there will be only a certain varieties that will live. So for example, if you look at this particular picture, this picture is of black robin of New Zealand. In 1980s, what was observed is that many of the black robins started to die. And with the death of these black robins, and it happened because of the human intervention, their habitats were being destroyed. And because of that, we saw that there was a drastic reduction in the population of these black robins. So much so that only 5 black robins were left. So when there are only 5 of these species left, it means that the genetic variability that you might have had will start to decrease. Just imagine, we have seen the COVID situation and we have seen how we collectively as humans have not been able to fight it. We are taking precautions, the vaccines have taken so much of time and we are still not sure when the vaccines will come. Now, looking at all these perspectives, we still have been very lucky that a disease like COVID had just a small death rate. It has a death rate of not more than 2.5%. It varies in different studies that we have seen. There is no official figure as such, but we know that it is not beyond 2 to 2.5%. We are very lucky here. Let's say there was this particular disease, a viral disease that has a death rate of 60 to 70%. We have seen this in certain cases. Now, if the death rate was 70% or 60%, it might have wiped out a huge population of humans. And in this case, what would have happened was a bottleneck effect. What is the bottleneck effect here? That a large race of humans is being destroyed. A large race of humans or genetic variability in humans has been eradicated from the earth. And then after that, only certain individuals are left, only certain species or certain genetic variabilities are left. So when that happens, in that case, we see a situation where bottleneck effect will happen. And because of the bottleneck effect, we'll see that there will be only small genetic variations, and because there are only small genetic variations, there will be inbreeding that will happen. Now, with inbreeding, what happens is that the upcoming generations will not be as strong, will not be as resilient as the generations that were before the bottleneck effect happened. So all these kind of things will lead to ultimately death or the extinction of that species. So that's why studying something like this also becomes so important. We are not only studying the genetic and the species and the ecological diversity just for the sake of classification. We are also studying it so that we can understand the broader perspective. We can understand what can happen to a species in a given situation, like something like a bottleneck effect. And that's why understanding of these concepts becomes very, very important. And we'll take many such examples, we'll come across many such examples as we move on with this particular topic. But you have to understand that why studying of biodiversity becomes so important.